You are listening to Unseen Givens by Elton Thomas. Part 7, Chapters 25 through 28. Chapter 25, Mr. Hendrick's Guilt Unveiled. Part 1, The Burden of Memory. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds in Mr. Hendrick's office, casting soft stripes of light and shadow across the room. It was quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the thick windows, leaving only the faint sound of papers rustling as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant and unfocused. There was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't seem to shake, a tension that had taken root long ago, and each day it seemed to grow, to press down on him with an unrelenting weight. Across from him, Laura sat quietly, her posture relaxed yet attentive, her gaze steady as she watched him with a mixture of patience and curiosity. She had come to him with a question about one of the project reports, a simple request for clarification that had somehow led them here, to this moment, where silence stretched between them like a thread, fragile and delicate. Mr. Hendrick let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the armrest as he gathered his thoughts, feeling the familiar ache of memories that he had tried so hard to bury. There was a part of him that wanted to remain silent, to keep the past locked away, hidden beneath layers of professionalism and distance. But as he looked at Laura, at the quiet strength in her gaze, he felt his resolve falter, a crack forming in the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart. "Laura," he began, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as though he were testing the waters. Have you ever felt as though the past is something you can never truly leave behind?" Laura's brow furrowed slightly, a look of curiosity mingling with something deeper, a faint glimmer of empathy that softened her gaze. "Yes," she replied, her tone gentle, understanding. "I think we all have memories that stay with us, that shape who we are, even if we'd rather not carry them." Mr. Hendrick nodded, his gaze drifting to the floor as he struggled to find the right words, the right way to convey the weight of what he carried without revealing too much. There was a tightness in his throat, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe, to speak, as though the memories were pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. There was an accident," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "A long time ago. I was there and I tried to help, but—" His voice trailed off, the words catching in his throat as he struggled to continue, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, a constant, unyielding presence that he could never truly escape. Laura's expression softened, a look of quiet sympathy crossing her face as she listened, her gaze steady, supportive. She didn't press him, didn't interrupt, simply waited, her presence a silent encouragement that allowed him to continue. "There was a child," he said after a moment, his voice barely audible, as though the admission itself was a wound that he could barely bring himself to expose. "A young boy. He was trapped and I tried to reach him to pull him out, but I couldn't. I wasn't fast enough." His voice cracked on the last word, a faint tremor that betrayed the depth of his pain, the guilt that had lingered, festering, in the depths of his heart for years. He closed his eyes, his hands clenching into fists as he remembered the frantic moments, the sound of sirens blaring in the distance, the smell of smoke and gasoline filling the air, the weight of the child in his arms, so still, so small, as he had tried, and failed, to save him. "I held him," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I held him, and I told him everything would be all right. But it wasn't. It never was." There was a tremor in his voice, a raw vulnerability that he could no longer hide, the facade he had built around himself crumbling under the weight of his confession. He could feel Laura's gaze on him, steady and unflinching, a quiet strength that seemed to hold him together even as he felt himself unraveling. "I wanted to save him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to give him a chance, to give his family a chance. But I couldn't. I failed, and I don't know how to live with that." He looked up, meeting Laura's gaze, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. She didn't say anything, didn't offer empty platitudes or assurances, simply held his gaze, her presence a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone, that his pain was seen, acknowledged. The silence stretched between them, heavy and profound, a shared moment of vulnerability that spoke of pain and loss, of memories that lingered like ghosts, haunting the spaces between them. And in that silence, Mr. Hendricks felt a small measure of relief, a faint easing of the weight that had pressed down on him for so long. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible as he looked away, unable to bear the compassion in her gaze. "I didn't mean to burden you with this." Laura shook her head, her expression softening as she leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You're not burdening me, Mr. Hendricks. I think sometimes we need to share these things, to let someone else carry the weight, if only for a little while." He looked up, his gaze searching her face, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and regret. He hadn't expected her to understand, hadn't expected the quiet strength, the unwavering support that she offered so freely, without judgment or pity. It was a kindness he hadn't known he needed, a balm for the wounds he had carried alone for so long. "There are days," he said softly, his voice trembling, "when I wonder if there was more I could have done, if I could have somehow changed the outcome. But those questions, they haunt me. They keep me awake at night." Laura nodded, her own gaze distant, as though she were remembering something painful, something that echoed his own struggles. "I think we all have those questions," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Those moments where we wonder if we could have done something differently, if we could have changed the course of events. But sometimes things happen that are beyond our control, and all we can do is carry them, learn from them, and try to find a way to keep moving forward." Mr. Hendricks looked at her, a mixture of awe and gratitude in his gaze as he absorbed her words, the quiet wisdom that spoke of a resilience he hadn't fully understood until now. There was a strength in her, a quiet courage that he hadn't seen before, a determination to keep going, even in the face of the pain that lingered beneath the surface. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. I don't know if I deserve it, but thank you." She smiled, a gentle, compassionate smile that softened the hard edges of his guilt, the unrelenting ache that had haunted him for so long. "We all deserve kindness, Mr. Hendricks, especially when we're carrying something heavy." The words settled over him, a balm that soothed the raw edges of his pain, the guilt that had weighed on him like a stone. He took a deep breath, the tension easing from his shoulders as he allowed himself to let go, if only for a moment, to trust in the quiet strength that she offered so freely. As they sat in silence, a shared understanding settled between them, a quiet connection that spoke of shared struggles, of memories that lingered like shadows. And in that silence, he felt a measure of peace, a faint hope that perhaps, someday, he might find a way to forgive himself, to let go of the weight that had held him captive for so long. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm, golden glow over the office. And in that light, Mr. Hendricks felt a sense of relief, a quiet, tentative peace that filled the spaces between them, a promise that he was not alone, that he was seen, and in some small way, understood. Part 2. The Weight of Compassion and Memory. Laura left Mr. Hendricks's office with a sense of quiet heaviness, his words echoing in her mind as she made her way back to her desk. The atmosphere in his office had shifted, a fragile silence settling over them as he'd confessed pieces of his past, fragments of a memory that carried an almost palpable weight. She could still feel the intensity in his voice, the way he had struggled to speak, his words laced with a sorrow so raw, so deep, that it had tugged at something within her. As she reached her desk, Laura sat down slowly, her gaze drifting to the stack of papers before her, though her mind was elsewhere, caught up in the emotions of the moment. Mr. Hendricks's story lingered in her thoughts, stirring memories of her own, fragments of images and sounds, half-buried memories of laughter and love that filled her with an aching sense of loss. There had been a boy, he'd said, a child he couldn't save. Laura closed her eyes, a wave of sympathy washing over her as she tried to imagine the depth of his guilt, the sorrow he must carry each day. She couldn't know the specifics of his experience, the details he had left unsaid, but she understood what it meant to lose someone, to carry the memory of a loved one like a delicate glass vessel, so precious and fragile that it felt as though it might shatter at the slightest touch. As she sat in the quiet of her own thoughts, a familiar whisper brushed against the edges of her consciousness, a sound so faint, so soft, that it could have been her imagination. Lim. The voice was a gentle murmur, warm and loving, a sound that held all the familiarity and comfort of home, of a presence she had loved more than anything in the world. Her chest tightened, a bittersweet ache rising within her as she remembered Hank, her little boy who had filled her life with so much light, so much joy. The memory of him was woven into the fabric of her being, an integral part of who she was, even though he was no longer with her. She could still see his bright, eager face, his eyes wide with wonder as he'd told her stories about dinosaurs and superheroes, as he'd proudly shared his newest discoveries, his boundless curiosity and joy filling their home with laughter. Lim. Love you, Mom. The simple phrase had become their little code, a shared sentiment that had grown more meaningful over time. He had started saying it when he was barely old enough to talk, the words tumbling out in his small, soft voice, each syllable filled with innocence and affection. She had treasured those moments, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his tiny arms wrapped around her neck, his breath against her cheek as he whispered those 3 little letters. Her eyes stung with unshed tears as she opened them, her gaze unfocused as she stared at her desk, her mind lost in memories of Hank. She could almost feel his presence, a faint warmth that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, a reminder of the love they had shared, the bond that connected them even now. It was a bond that transcended time, that remained unbroken despite the years that had passed, a testament to the strength of their love. As she sat there, wrapped in the warmth of his memory, she reflected on his short life, on the joy and wonder he had brought into her world. He had been her light, her reason to wake up each morning, her source of strength and purpose. Losing him had been a wound that time could never truly heal, a pain that lingered, raw and aching, beneath the surface of her heart. But there was a sweetness to the pain, a reminder that he had existed, that he had been hers, even if only for a brief time. She held on to that thought, the comfort of knowing that his memory lived on within her, a part of her that she would carry for the rest of her life. A soft smile touched her lips as she remembered the way he had looked up at her, his eyes wide with admiration, his little face filled with love. He had trusted her, looked to her as his protector, his guide, his hero, and she had done everything she could to live up to that trust, to be the mother he deserved, the mother who would love him fiercely, unconditionally, for as long as she had breath in her lungs. The sound of laughter drifted through the office, a faint reminder of the present, but Laura remained in her thoughts, her mind caught in the past, in the memories that held her captive. She thought of all the moments they had shared, the small, ordinary moments that had woven together to create a tapestry of love and joy. The way he had clung to her hand as they walked through the park, his tiny fingers curled around hers, his voice bubbling with excitement as he pointed out every bird, every tree, every flower. The way he had laughed, a bright, uninhibited sound that filled her heart with warmth. And then there were the quiet moments, the times when he had fallen asleep in her arms, his head resting against her chest, his small body warm and trusting as he surrendered to sleep. She could still feel the weight of him, the softness of his hair against her cheek, the steady rhythm of his breathing as he lay in her arms, safe and content. Those were the moments she held closest to her heart, the memories that had become her sanctuary, her refuge in the years since he had gone. Her heart ached as she thought of him, a deep, unyielding sorrow that mingled with the love she still carried for him. She wondered if he would have grown up to be a kind, curious boy, if he would have kept his love for dinosaurs, if he would have become the brave, adventurous soul she had always believed him to be. She wondered if he would have remembered their little code, if he would have continued to whisper those 3 little letters, LYM, as he grew older. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away, a small, bittersweet smile on her lips as she whispered, "Love you too, Hank." The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up, blinking away the tears as she saw Mr. Hendricks standing nearby, his expression unreadable as he watched her. She hadn't realized he was there, hadn't noticed his approach, but she could see a hint of understanding in his gaze, a quiet sympathy that spoke of shared loss, of a pain he, too, carried. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant, as though he were afraid to intrude. Laura managed a small smile, nodding as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, I'm fine. Just remembering." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. "Memories have a way of sneaking up on us, don't they?" "They do," she agreed, her voice soft, her gaze distant as she looked past him, her mind still caught in the memories of her son. "Sometimes, it feels like they're all we have left." Mr. Hendricks's expression softened, a look of quiet empathy crossing his face as he nodded. "But they're also a reminder," he said, his tone thoughtful, "of the love we shared, of the lives we touched. And that's something worth holding on to." Laura looked at him, her eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude, a sense of understanding that bridged the distance between them. She hadn't fully understood his pain, hadn't connected the dots, but she sensed that they shared something, a bond of loss and memory, of love that endured even in the face of sorrow. As Mr. Hendricks turned to leave, Laura closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her, a bittersweet comfort that filled her with warmth. The sound of Lim echoed in her mind, a soft, gentle whisper that carried with it all the love she had felt, all the joy and wonder that had been her son. And in that moment, she knew that she would carry him with her, always, a part of her heart that would never truly be lost. "Love you, Hank." Chapter 26. The Final Project Meeting. Part 1. Determined to break the curse. The Printess project had reached its final stages, and the air in the office was electric. Laura could feel the tension building, a palpable sense of excitement and anticipation that had infected everyone around her. The culmination of months of work, late nights, and endless revisions was finally here, and the team at Givens Corp was abuzz, their efforts paying off in ways that were both satisfying and exhilarating. It was the kind of moment that made all the hard work worthwhile, a shared accomplishment that brought them together in a way that few things could. But for Laura, there was something else fueling her anticipation, a goal that had become almost mythical in her mind, a challenge she had grown increasingly determined to overcome. For weeks, she had come so close to meeting Ross Givens, their elusive CEO, only to miss him by a hair each time. Each attempt had felt like an intricate joke, a twist of fate that seemed determined to keep them apart. She had missed him due to everything from power outages to elevator malfunctions. Just last week, they had been in the same building, on the same floor, only to have a fire alarm trigger moments before their meeting, scattering everyone to the exits. And now, as they prepared for what was expected to be the final meeting for the Printess project, Laura felt a quiet, fierce determination. This was it. She would meet Ross Givens today, even if she had to camp outside the conference room to do it. As she walked into the office that morning, she was greeted with a series of nods and knowing smiles, her colleagues giving her looks that ranged from sympathetic to amused. "Today's the day, right, Laura?" Adam grinned as he crossed paths with her by the elevator. "Or are we going to witness another legendary near miss?" Laura laughed, shaking her head as she adjusted the stack of files in her arms. "No more near misses, Adam. Today I'm meeting Ross if it's the last thing I do." He chuckled, giving her a friendly pat on the back. "I believe in you, but, maybe we should have backup plans, just in case the Givens curse strikes again." "Oh, don't even think it," she replied, rolling her eyes though her smile never faltered. "I've got this covered." Yet, deep down, she could feel a knot of tension, a small nagging voice whispering that things might not go as smoothly as she hoped. The entire office had become aware of her ongoing saga, her persistent bad luck with Ross, and it had become something of a running joke, one that both entertained and exasperated her. As she settled into her desk, Sharon approached, her eyes gleaming with amusement. All right, Laura, spill the details. How do you plan to finally corner Ross Givens today? I think we're all invested at this point. Laura chuckled, shaking her head as she looked over her files. I don't know if it's going to take much planning. I just have to be in the right place at the right time. And for once, the stars need to align. Oh, they'd better, Sharon replied, leaning against Laura's desk, her expression conspiratorial. If not, we're throwing you a pity party. Or maybe a victory party for your persistence. Either way, there'll be cake. Laura laughed, the sound blending with the light-hearted buzz of the office around her. The energy was contagious, a shared excitement that filled the space with an almost tangible warmth. But beneath it all, she could feel the weight of her own anticipation, a tension that simmered just below the surface, a quiet determination that made her straighten in her seat, her gaze resolute. As the morning wore on, she kept her focus sharp, reviewing her notes, going over the final presentation points for the Prentice project. Every detail had to be perfect, every aspect polished and prepared, and she poured herself into the work, her concentration unwavering. The clock ticked steadily forward, the minutes slipping by as the final meeting drew closer. Laura's colleagues passed her desk periodically, offering words of encouragement, playful nudges, and knowing winks, all of them clearly invested in her mission. It was as though her goal had become a shared endeavor, a collective hope that had brought them together in a way that felt both supportive and endearing. Finally, the time arrived. Laura gathered her notes, double-checking each one before slipping them into her folder. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her blouse and straightening her posture, her gaze fixed and determined. This was it. She would meet Ross Givens, shake his hand, and introduce herself at last. There would be no more missed connections, no more mishaps. She had waited long enough. As she made her way down the hall toward the conference room, her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves, each step bringing her closer to the moment she had been waiting for. She could see her colleagues watching her from their desks, their expressions filled with encouragement, their silent support a reassuring presence as she approached the door. She reached the conference room, pausing outside for a moment as she took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the folder in her hands. She could hear voices from inside, the faint murmur of conversation that told her the meeting was about to begin. With a final nod to herself, she pushed open the door, stepping inside. The room was filled with her teammates, each one glancing up as she entered, their faces lighting up with anticipation. Jared was seated near the head of the table, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth as he caught her eye. "Laura," he said, his tone warm, "welcome to the final showdown." She rolled her eyes good-naturedly, taking a seat near the head of the table as she glanced around. All right, no pressure or anything." They laughed, the tension easing as they settled into their seats, the meeting beginning with the usual pleasantries and introductions. Laura's focus remained sharp, her gaze flicking to the door every now and then, her anticipation building with each passing minute. She was ready, prepared to seize the moment the second Ross entered the room. But as the minutes slipped by, she felt a faint sense of unease creeping in, a quiet tension that whispered of yet another potential mishap. She glanced at her watch, noting the time as her mind raced with questions. Ross was supposed to be here by now. He had confirmed his attendance earlier, had even personally requested the meeting to review the final stages of the Prentice project. And yet, as the meeting continued, there was no sign of him. Sharon leaned over, giving Laura a sympathetic smile as she whispered, "Maybe he's just running late. You know, CEO stuff." Laura nodded, though she could feel her heart sinking, a quiet frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had come so close, had been so certain that this time, at long last, she would meet him. But as the minutes ticked by, her hope began to wane, a sinking feeling settling in her chest as the reality of the situation became clear. Finally, just as they were about to conclude the meeting, Jared's phone buzzed, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet room. He glanced down at the screen, his brow furrowing as he read the message, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he said, looking up with a mixture of amusement and resignation, "it appears that Mr. Givens will not be joining us today." Laura's heart sank, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as she forced herself to remain composed. "Why not?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled, though a hint of exasperation slipped through. Jared chuckled, shaking his head as he read the message again. "It seems he accidentally locked himself out of his car this morning. He's been trying to get it sorted out, but by the time he got it all figured out, he realized he wouldn't make it in time for the meeting." The room erupted into laughter, the sound filling the space as her colleagues exchanged knowing glances, each one clearly amused by the latest twist in the Givens curse. Laura couldn't help but join in, her frustration melting into laughter as she shook her head, a rueful smile on her lips. "Of course he did," she murmured, her tone light, though there was a hint of exasperation in her gaze. It wouldn't be a proper Givens Corp meeting if he actually showed up. Sharon leaned over, patting her on the back as she grinned. "I hate to say it, Laura, but at this point, I think the universe is just having fun with you." "Oh, don't I know it," Laura replied, laughing as she leaned back in her chair, the tension easing as she allowed herself to embrace the humor of the situation. Jared cleared his throat, his grin widening as he addressed the room. "All right, team, let's wrap things up. And Laura, better luck next time. Maybe we'll throw you a Meet Ross party once you actually manage to meet the guy." The room erupted in laughter again, the sound warm and filled with camaraderie as Laura rolled her eyes, though she couldn't hide her smile. It was absurd, this endless saga, but in that moment, surrounded by her teammates' laughter and support, it felt less like a failure and more like a shared experience, a story that connected them all. As they filed out of the conference room, Adam walked over, clapping her on the shoulder as he chuckled. "Don't worry, Laura. One of these days it's bound to happen, and when it does, I'll be there to witness it." "Thanks, Adam," she replied, her smile softening as she looked around at her colleagues, their expressions filled with encouragement. "At least I know I'm not in this alone." They laughed, their voices blending into the light-hearted buzz of the office, a shared moment of humor that softened the disappointment, turning it into something she could laugh about, something that felt less like a curse and more like a part of her journey at Givens Corp. And as she returned to her desk, a quiet smile on her lips, she couldn't help but feel a sense of determination rising within her. One day, she would meet Ross Givens. The universe could throw every obstacle in her path, but she would keep trying, keep reaching, until that day finally arrived. Part 2. Mellie's Journey to Sight. The soft hum of conversations filled the air as Mellie walked down the familiar corridors of the school, her fingers lightly trailing along the wall. She could hear the laughter of her classmates echoing in the hall, their voices a comforting reminder of the place that had been her world for so long. The school for the blind had been a haven, a place where she had learned to navigate her life without sight, a place that had given her not only education, but confidence and resilience. Yet, as her graduation approached, there was an excitement simmering within her, a determination that grew stronger with each passing day. Mellie had decided she wanted to pursue a business degree. It had come to her like a quiet revelation, the pieces slowly falling into place over her final year at the school. She had always been fascinated by problem solving, by the way businesses could shape and influence the world around them. While others might have found the idea of business intimidating, Mellie saw it as a challenge, a landscape filled with endless possibilities. One afternoon, she sat in the quiet of the school's small library, her fingers lightly brushing across the braille pages of a business studies book. She could feel her heart racing with anticipation as she read about concepts she hadn't known before, about management, innovation, strategy. It felt like unlocking a secret language, a new world that was opening up to her, one that she was determined to explore. Her teacher, Mrs. Larson, found her there, seated in the warm light of the library, a look of concentration on her face. Mellie could hear Mrs. Larson's soft footsteps approaching, could sense her presence even before she spoke. "Mellie," Mrs. Larson said, her voice filled with warmth, "I thought I'd find you here." Mellie smiled, looking up as she set the book aside. "I can't seem to stay away. There's just so much to learn." Mrs. Larson chuckled, settling into the seat beside her. "You've always had a curious mind, Mellie. That curiosity will take you far, you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the warm light filtering through the library windows casting gentle shadows across the room. Melly could feel the excitement building within her, a quiet thrill that filled her with a sense of purpose. "I think I want to study business," she said softly, almost to herself. "I want to understand how things work, how decisions are made, maybe even make a difference someday." Mrs. Larson smiled, reaching over to place a gentle hand on Melly's shoulder. "You will, Melly. I have no doubt about that. You've always been determined, always willing to go the extra mile. If anyone can do it, it's you." The words filled her with a quiet confidence, a reassurance that warmed her heart. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that there would be obstacles and uncertainties, but she was ready. She wanted to make her mark, to show the world that she was capable, that she could contribute in ways beyond what anyone might expect. Graduation came and went in a flurry of celebration, a bittersweet moment as she bid farewell to her classmates and teachers. The ceremony was filled with laughter, with promises to stay in touch, with memories that would stay with her for a lifetime. As she stood on the stage, receiving her diploma, she could feel the weight of her accomplishment, the culmination of years of hard work, of resilience, of determination. It was a moment that filled her with pride, a reminder of how far she had come, of all the things she had overcome. But just as she was preparing to leave the school and embark on her journey into the world of business, life took an unexpected turn. One morning, as she was packing her things in the dormitory, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find the school principal, Mr. Windle, standing there, his expression one of quiet excitement. "Melly," he said, his voice warm and filled with emotion. "I have some news for you. You may want to sit down." Curious, Melly took a seat, her hands folded in her lap as she waited, a hint of anticipation building within her. "We've received an incredible offer," Mr. Windle began, his voice gentle yet filled with excitement. "There's a company, Givens Corporation. They've offered to sponsor a medical procedure for you, one that could potentially restore your sight." The words hung in the air, surreal and impossible. Melly's heart raced, a mix of disbelief and wonder filling her as she tried to process what he had just said. "Restore my sight?" Mr. Windle nodded, his expression one of compassion and hope. "It's a new procedure, experimental but promising, and Givens Corp is willing to cover all the expenses, not just for the surgery, but also for the rehabilitation services afterward. They believe in supporting individuals like you, in giving people the chance to pursue their dreams to the fullest." Melly sat in stunned silence, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions that she could barely comprehend. It felt like a dream, an impossible opportunity that had suddenly become real. For as long as she could remember, she had lived in a world of sounds, of textures, of sensations that guided her through life. The idea of seeing, of experiencing the world visually, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What? What would it be like?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and trepidation. Mr. Windle placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It would be a journey, Melly, a new beginning, but I have no doubt that you would face it with the same strength, the same courage, that you've shown in everything else." Over the next few weeks, Melly prepared herself for the surgery, her emotions a whirlwind of excitement, fear, and anticipation. The thought of seeing for the first time, of experiencing a world that had always been hidden from her, filled her with a sense of awe, a quiet determination to embrace this new chapter with open arms. When the day of the surgery arrived, she felt a strange calm settle over her, a sense of readiness that steadied her nerves. As she lay on the operating table, the doctors speaking to her in calm, reassuring voices, she focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm that grounded her, that reminded her of all the challenges she had overcome. The procedure was a blur, a series of sensations and sounds that passed in a haze as she drifted in and out of consciousness. And then, hours later, she awoke. The world around her filled with a new kind of light, a soft, gentle glow that seeped through her closed eyelids, hinting at a reality she had never known. It took weeks of recovery, of careful adjustments and gradual adaptation. But finally, the day came when she was ready to open her eyes to the world for the first time. Surrounded by her doctors and nurses, she sat in a chair, her heart pounding with anticipation as they guided her through the process, their voices calm and steady. "Are you ready, Melly?" one of the doctors asked, his tone gentle, encouraging. She took a deep breath, nodding as she reached up, her fingers trembling as she removed the bandages that covered her eyes. For a moment, there was only darkness, a familiar emptiness that felt almost comforting. But then slowly, shapes and colors began to emerge, soft and blurry at first, then gradually sharpening into focus. The world unfolded before her, a mosaic of colors and textures, of lights and shadows that filled her with awe. She could see the faces of the people around her, the lines and expressions that hinted at their emotions, their kindness, their care. She could see the room, the walls and furniture, the details that she had only ever imagined. Tears filled her eyes as she took it all in, her heart racing with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the chair, marveling at the way the textures met her gaze, the way her eyes could now convey the details she had once only known through touch. It was overwhelming, a flood of sensations that left her breathless, a reality that felt both foreign and familiar. She could feel the warmth of their smiles, the encouragement in their eyes, and for the first time, she understood the power of sight, the gift that had been given to her. Her journey didn't end there. She was enrolled in the new Sight Center, a rehabilitation facility designed to help individuals adapt to life as a sighted person. Each day was a new challenge, a new lesson in understanding the world visually, in learning to trust her eyes as much as she had once trusted her other senses. She spent hours learning to read, to recognize faces, to navigate spaces. She learned about colors, about depth and distance, about the way light and shadows danced across the room, creating a reality that was rich and layered. It was exhausting, challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated, but with each step, she grew stronger, more confident, more at ease in her new world. Givens Corp covered all the expenses, a gift that filled her with gratitude, a reminder that there were people who believed in her, who saw her potential, and were willing to invest in her future. It was a gift that she would never take for granted, a chance to see the world in ways she had never imagined, a chance to pursue her dreams with a new sense of purpose. Melly knew that this was just the beginning, a new chapter that held endless possibilities. She was ready to embrace it all, to face each day with courage and determination, to make her mark on the world in her own way. And as she looked out at the world, at the colors and textures that filled her vision, she felt a quiet sense of wonder, a deep, abiding gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. Chapter 27. The Moment Approaches. Part 1. Thunderstorm and Anticipation. The buzz of excitement filled the air at Givens Corp that morning. It was the day of the company's annual outdoor picnic, a grand event held at a beautiful park just outside the city. Tables and tents had been set up, decorations strung between trees, and catering trucks lined up, ready to serve everything from gourmet sandwiches to fresh lemonade. There were colorful banners with the Givens Corp logo fluttering in the light breeze, and laughter and conversation already rippled through the hallways as employees prepared to head out to the event. And today, for Laura, this picnic was more than just a casual gathering. This was her chance, her moment, the long-awaited opportunity to finally meet Ross Givens. There was an air of destiny in the anticipation that settled around her, an energy that made every movement feel charged with purpose. She had made peace with the near misses, the strange twists of fate that had kept them apart for so long, but today, there would be no last-minute hurdles, no more Givens' curse. She was going to shake his hand, introduce herself, and finally meet the man who had been just out of reach for what felt like an eternity. Her co-workers shared in her excitement. Adam had found her by the coffee station early that morning, his eyes sparkling with amusement as he handed her a fresh cup of coffee. "Today's the day, Laura. I can feel it," he said, grinning as he raised his cup in a toast. "The Givens curse doesn't stand a chance." She laughed, taking the coffee with a grateful smile. "I think the entire office is as invested in this as I am." "Oh, absolutely," he replied, his tone sincere. "It's like office lore now. Laura's long quest for Ross Givens. If you actually meet him today, we're throwing a celebration." Laura chuckled, rolling her eyes though she couldn't hide her smile. "Then let's hope the universe is on our side for once." As she walked back to her desk, Sharon waved her over, her eyes gleaming with a conspiratorial glint. "Are you ready for this, Laura?" Laura nodded, a thrill of excitement running through her. I don't think I've ever been this ready for anything in my life. Sharon laughed, patting her on the shoulder. Well, I've got my camera ready. If you actually meet him, I want it documented. You're all making it sound like I'm climbing Everest, Laura replied, though her heart was racing in agreement. Well, meeting Ross Givens might just be the Everest of Givens Corp., Sharon said with a wink. The office was buzzing with energy, everyone gathering supplies, checking picnic details, and preparing for the event. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air as people moved through the halls, exchanging stories about past company picnics and making plans for games and activities. Laura glanced out the window, taking in the bright blue sky and the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves on the trees outside. It was a perfect day for an outdoor event, the kind of day that practically invited people to relax and enjoy themselves. And she could already envision it. She would find Ross somewhere near the main tent, introduce herself, shake his hand, and finally break the curse that had followed her since her first day. She felt a surge of confidence as she collected her things, the small stack of papers and notes she had prepared just in case she needed them for a brief discussion. Her outfit was carefully chosen. A simple but elegant blouse, jeans that struck the perfect balance between casual and professional, and a pair of comfortable but stylish shoes. She was ready, and her colleagues could sense it too, cheering her on as she moved toward the elevators. You've got this, Laura, Jared called from his desk, raising a fist in encouragement. Today's the day. She gave him a thumbs up, her smile wide and filled with determination. Thank you, Jared. This is it. As they piled into the shuttles to head to the park, the atmosphere was lighthearted and filled with laughter. Laura sat by the window, watching the city blur by as they drove toward the open green spaces and fresh air. Her heart beat with a steady rhythm of excitement, each passing mile bringing her closer to the moment she had been waiting for. By the time they arrived at the park, the setup was nearly complete. Tables were draped with bright tablecloths, and chairs were arranged around small clusters of games and activities. The catering trucks were stationed near the entrance, their enticing aromas wafting through the air and mingling with the fresh scent of grass and sunshine. Laura took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of the warm sunlight on her skin, the gentle breeze that brushed against her face, and the hum of conversation around her. Her teammates quickly found her, gathering in a circle as they surveyed the picnic grounds, each of them sharing in her excitement. All right, Laura, Adam said, clapping her on the shoulder. Ross is supposed to be here any minute. You know what to do. She grinned, nodding as she adjusted her bag. No more mishaps. This is happening. They laughed, exchanging amused glances as they settled into their own small group, watching the entrance with anticipation. Sharon had her phone ready, her finger hovering over the camera button as she waited to capture the moment. Laura's heart was pounding, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say, the introduction she had rehearsed countless times. And then, as if on cue, the sky began to shift. A few clouds drifted in, their edges tinged with gray, and a faint breeze picked up, rustling the trees with a soft, warning murmur. Laura glanced up, a hint of concern flickering across her face as she watched the clouds gather, their shadows stretching across the grass in uneven patches. Don't worry, Adam said, noticing her gaze. It's just a few clouds. Nothing's going to stop you today. She nodded, taking a steadying breath as she refocused her attention on the entrance. But as the minutes ticked by, the clouds continued to thicken, the sky darkening with a foreboding intensity that made her pulse quicken. A low rumble echoed in the distance, the sound rolling across the park like a warning. Laura's heart sank as she looked up, watching as the once blue sky transformed into a sea of gray, the clouds swelling and churning with a dark energy that sent a shiver down her spine. Oh no, Sharon murmured, her gaze fixed on the sky. This can't be happening. As if in answer, a sudden gust of wind swept through the park, sending the banners flapping wildly, the decorations tangling and twisting in the air. The tables rattled, their tablecloths whipping around as people glanced up in surprise, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern. And then, in an instant, the heavens opened. The rain came down in torrents, sheets of water that cascaded from the sky, drenching everything in sight. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, sending leaves and decorations flying as people scrambled for cover, their laughter replaced by shrieks and exclamations of disbelief. Laura stood frozen, her mind reeling as she watched the scene unfold, her heart sinking with each drop of rain that splattered against her face. The carefully prepared picnic, the decorations, the tables. It was all being washed away, swept up in the chaos of the storm. "Laura!" Adam called, grabbing her arm as he gestured toward the shuttle. "Come on, we need to get back to cover." She nodded, her movements mechanical as she followed him, her mind racing with disappointment, with frustration, with a quiet, simmering anger at the universe for playing yet another trick on her. This had been her moment, her chance, and it had been stolen from her in the most dramatic, infuriating way possible. They piled back into the shuttle, their clothes soaked, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Sharon shook her head, wiping water from her face as she laughed, a helpless, rueful sound that seemed to capture the absurdity of it all. "Only you, Laura," she said, her tone filled with a strange mixture of sympathy and amusement. "Only you would have a storm ruin your one chance to meet Ross Givens." Laura managed to laugh, though it was tinged with frustration. "I don't think there's a force in the universe that wants me to meet this man." The shuttle ride back to the office was filled with laughter and commiseration, her colleagues offering words of support, of encouragement, though they couldn't hide the humor in their eyes. The story had become legendary, a tale that would be told and retold for years to come, a testament to Laura's unyielding determination in the face of the most absurd circumstances. By the time they returned to the office, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a sky that was once again clear and bright, the sunlight streaming down as if nothing had happened. Laura shook her head, laughing as she stepped out of the shuttle, her heart a mix of disappointment and amusement. "You know," she said, turning to her teammates with a wry smile, "if anyone needs proof that I'm cursed, I think we just found it." They laughed, patting her on the back, their voices filled with warmth and encouragement as they assured her that one day, somehow, she would break the curse, that she would meet Ross, and it would be worth the wait. And as Laura looked around at the faces of her friends, at the smiles and laughter that surrounded her, she felt a sense of gratitude, a quiet, enduring warmth that softened the edges of her disappointment. The storm had stolen her moment, but it hadn't taken away the camaraderie, the support, the friendships that had grown from her ongoing quest to meet Ross Givens. One day, she thought, as she looked up at the sky, her gaze filled with determination. One day, the Givens curse would be broken, and she would finally meet the man who had been just out of reach for so long. And when that day came, she knew it would be worth every near miss, every laugh, every moment of anticipation, because in the end, it was the journey, the friendships, and the shared laughter that had made it all worthwhile. Part 2. The Givens Curse Comedy Act. Back in the office, a sense of camaraderie and laughter filled the air, everyone still buzzing from the unexpected turn of events at the company picnic. Employees milled about the hallways, still in their damp clothes from the downpour, their laughter mingling with the hum of office chatter. The storm had been an unwelcome twist, yet somehow it had only added to the enjoyment. There was something about the absurdity of it all. The sudden clouds, the torrent of rain, the mad dash back to the shuttles, that made the day feel like a surreal comedy, a memory that would be told and retold for years to come. And at the heart of this day's laughter was Laura, or more accurately, Laura's legendary Givens curse. It had been yet another near miss, another strange twist of fate that had kept her from meeting the elusive Ross Givens, and now her colleagues were having a field day with it. The cluster of employees around her desk grew larger by the minute, each of them contributing to the endless stream of jokes, puns, and metaphors, the energy of the room charged with humor and light-hearted teasing. Sharon leaned against Laura's desk, her expression one of exaggerated sympathy as she reached out to pat Laura on the shoulder. "So close, yet so far," she said with a sigh, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "I swear, Laura, if fate were a person, it would be giving you the biggest middle finger right now." Laura laughed, shaking her head as she crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "At this point, I think fate just wants to keep me entertained. It's like I'm the star of my own sitcom." Adam, who had been hovering nearby, seized on the opportunity, a mischievous glint in his eyes as he stepped forward, raising his hands to gather everyone's attention. All right, everyone," he said, his voice filled with mock seriousness. "Gather round. Today, we're going to witness a special performance. Laura Owens and the Givens Curse. A tale of woe, of near misses, and of rain-soaked disappointment." Laughter erupted around them, the sound filling the office as people nudged each other, their eyes alight with anticipation. Laura groaned, rolling her eyes though she couldn't hide the smile that tugged at her lips. She gestured for him to continue, settling back as she braced herself for whatever antics he had planned. Adam launched into his routine, his voice a blend of melodrama and humor, his gestures exaggerated as he painted a picture of her ill-fated journey to meet Ross. He began pacing around the group, his hands raised dramatically as he set the stage, his expression one of tragicomic despair. "It all started on her very first day at Givens Corp," he began, his voice deep and filled with gravitas, as if narrating an epic tale. "Our hero, Laura Owens, walks through those doors, bright-eyed and eager, ready to make her mark. But little did she know, she was about to enter the twilight zone." The crowd laughed, some of them letting out mock gasps of horror, their hands flying to their mouths in exaggerated shock. Adam grinned, nodding approvingly as he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Since that day, Laura has been haunted," he said, his eyes wide as he leaned toward the crowd. "Haunted by a force greater than any of us could imagine. A force known only as the Givens Curse." A dramatic pause filled the air, the anticipation building as everyone leaned in, their expressions filled with mock horror and amusement. "That's right," Adam continued, pacing back and forth as he gestured wildly. "Every time she's about to meet Ross Givens, fate itself intervenes. Elevator malfunctions, power outages, fire alarms. Oh, and let's not forget the great cyber attack of 2023. The group erupted into laughter, clapping and cheering as Adam struck a pose, his hand shielding his eyes as if peering into the distance, his expression one of exaggerated despair. "But today," he exclaimed, his voice booming as he pointed at Laura, his eyes gleaming with mock conviction. "Today, the Givens Curse reached its ultimate form. Just when our brave Laura was mere feet away from her destiny, the very skies opened up, and a mighty thunderstorm swept across the land." He threw his arms up dramatically, mimicking the crash of thunder, his voice filled with theatrical sorrow as he looked skyward, his hands outstretched. Lightning struck, thunder rolled, and poor Laura was left, drenched and defeated, her hopes dashed yet again. Sharon doubled over with laughter, clutching her stomach as tears filled her eyes. "Oh my God, Adam, you're killing me." Laura shook her head, laughing so hard she could barely catch her breath. "I think you're having a little too much fun with this, Adam." "Oh, Laura, this is just the beginning," he replied, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a dramatic whisper. "The Givens Curse doesn't just prevent meetings. No, it's far more powerful than that." He took a step back, glancing around at the crowd as he raised his hands, his voice hushed, as if he were sharing a forbidden secret. "The Givens Curse is said to bring rain whenever Laura tries to make an impression. They say it follows her, a dark cloud that lurks in the shadows, just waiting to strike." Someone in the crowd let out a mock gasp, and the group dissolved into laughter once again, the energy in the room lifting with each joke, each exaggerated retelling of Laura's misfortunes. Adam continued, feeding off the laughter and applause as he launched into a series of puns, each one more ridiculous than the last. "They say Ross Givens is like Bigfoot to Laura," Adam announced, his face serious as he crossed his arms. "People swear he exists, but whenever she's around, he vanishes into the mist." More laughter erupted, and Laura leaned forward, clutching her stomach as tears filled her eyes, her face red with laughter. She could feel the tension of the day melting away, replaced by a warmth, a lightness that lifted her spirits. It was absurd, this whole situation, but in moments like these, surrounded by the laughter of her friends, it didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a story, a shared, ridiculous story that had become a part of the fabric of their lives at Givens Corp. "And if you listen closely," Adam said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he leaned in, his eyes gleaming with mischief. You can hear the curse speaking. It whispers. He cupped a hand to his ear, feigning concentration. It whispers, "Thou shalt not meeteth Ross Givens." Laura laughed so hard she could barely breathe, doubling over as her co-workers cheered, their voices blending into a cacophony of applause and laughter. Adam took a mock bow, grinning as he basked in the adulation, his performance a triumphant success. As the laughter finally began to fade, Sharon wiped a tear from her eye, shaking her head as she grinned at Laura. "I swear, Laura, we're going to write a book about this one day." Laura smiled, her heart full as she looked around at the faces of her friends, her laughter lingering in the air like a warm embrace. "Just promise me you'll all be here for the grand finale, when I finally do meet Ross. I'm going to need witnesses." "Oh, we'll be there," Adam replied, his expression earnest as he raised a hand in mock salute. "And when that day comes, Laura, we'll throw the biggest party Givens Corp has ever seen. Complete with lightning-proof tents and anti-curse charms," Sharon added with a wink. They all laughed, their voices echoing in the bustling office as they dispersed, each one carrying a piece of the shared joy, the absurdity of the day's events. Laura returned to her desk, her heart light, the laughter still warming her from the inside out. As she sat down, she looked out the window, a soft smile playing on her lips. She could see the last traces of the storm clouds drifting away, the sunlight breaking through in golden rays that cast a warm glow over the city. It was as if the universe itself were sharing in their laughter, offering a silent promise that one day she would break the curse. And until that day came, Laura would keep laughing, keep trying, keep reaching for the moment that had eluded her for so long. Because in the end, it wasn't just about meeting Ross Givens. It was about the journey, the friends who had stood by her, and the joy they had found in the unexpected, the absurd, the downright hilarious twists of fate. As the last traces of laughter faded into the office hum, Laura felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet confidence that filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. One day, she knew, she would meet Ross. But until then, she had her friends, her laughter, and the stories they would tell for years to come. And in that moment, that was enough. Chapter 28. The Reveal Begins. Part 1. A Walk in the Garden. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the city as Laura walked through the quiet, tree-lined paths of the nearby park. Frustration simmered beneath her calm expression, a quiet exasperation that had built up over yet another near miss with Ross Givens. After months, no, years, of almosts and maybes, of well-timed jokes about her curse, she had come so close to meeting him that morning. Just when she thought her endless cycle of missed connections was about to break, a last-minute call had pulled him away. She sighed, her hands slipping into the pockets of her jacket as she wandered along the winding trail. The park was peaceful, a refuge from the bustling office, and as she walked, she felt herself begin to unwind, her frustration ebbing away, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't felt all day. There was a quiet beauty here, a stillness that seemed to soften the edges of her disappointment, allowing her to breathe, to find a measure of peace. Eventually, her steps led her to a small garden tucked away from the main path, a hidden gem filled with clusters of blooming flowers and a fountain that bubbled gently at its center. The sound of the water was soothing, a soft, melodic rhythm that filled the air, mingling with the scent of lavender and rosemary that wafted from the nearby flower beds. The fountain was simple but elegant, its stone basin carved with intricate patterns, the water cascading down in gentle streams that caught the sunlight, creating a shimmering effect that felt almost magical. Laura paused, drawn to the fountain as she watched the play of light and water, the way the droplets caught the sun, each one a tiny prism that refracted the golden rays. She found herself mesmerized, her mind quiet as she took in the scene, the beauty and tranquility of this small, hidden sanctuary. In that moment, she felt a sense of connection, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. She had spent so much time chasing after things, goals, dreams, people, that she had forgotten the beauty of simply being, of allowing herself to pause, to breathe, to let go of the relentless pursuit and find joy in the present. And then, as she stood there, lost in thought. A voice spoke from behind her, low and warm, filled with a hint of amusement. "I heard you have a curse and are looking for someone to break it." Startled, Laura turned, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes landed on the figure standing a few feet away. There, leaning casually against a lamppost with a faint, knowing smile, was Ross Givens. He was exactly as she'd imagined him, tall and poised, his presence commanding yet approachable, his eyes filled with a warmth that softened the sharp angles of his features. For a moment, Laura could only stare, her mind racing to catch up with the reality before her. She had imagined this moment countless times, had rehearsed introductions and conversations in her mind. But now that he was here, in the flesh, her thoughts seemed to scatter, leaving her speechless. Ross chuckled, his smile widening as he took a step forward, extending his hand. "I hope I didn't interrupt your reflection," he said, his tone light, as though he were completely unaware of the weight this moment carried. Laura managed to pull herself together, a smile breaking across her face as she reached out, her hand slipping into his. "Not at all," she replied, her voice steady despite the excitement that bubbled within her. "I suppose it's only fitting that we meet here, after all the other attempts." He nodded, amusement flickering in his gaze as he shook her hand. "It seems fate has a sense of humor when it comes to us. But I'm glad we finally managed to cross paths." They shared a laugh, the tension easing as they stood there, hand in hand, the unspoken weight of their near misses lingering between them. As they released the handshake, Laura found herself relaxing, her initial nervousness giving way to a quiet confidence, a sense of ease that felt both surprising and natural. "Honestly, Mr. Givens, Ross," she corrected, catching his small nod of approval, "I think the entire office has been waiting for this moment almost as much as I have. They've been calling it the Givens curse for a while now." He chuckled, shaking his head as he crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the lamppost. "The Givens curse, huh? I have to admit, I'm honored. It's not every day that I'm part of such a legendary office tale." Laura laughed, nodding in agreement. "Legendary is definitely the word for it. I think every possible thing that could go wrong did, just to keep us from meeting." He regarded her with a thoughtful expression, his gaze steady as he spoke. "Well, if there's anything I've learned in life, it's that sometimes the best things take time. Maybe this is one of those times." There was a warmth in his voice, a sincerity that caught her off guard, and for a moment, they simply stood there, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding that transcended words. After a pause, Ross tilted his head slightly, a curious glint in his eye. "Tell me, Laura," he began, his tone gentle yet probing. "What's your story? How did you end up here, at Givens Corp., chasing down our elusive CEO?" Laura hesitated, her mind racing as she considered where to begin. There was so much to tell, so many moments that had led her here, to this company, to this moment. She glanced back at the fountain, the gentle trickle of water calming her as she gathered her thoughts. "It's a bit of a long story," she admitted, a hint of laughter in her voice as she looked back at him. "But I suppose the short version is that I've always wanted to make a difference. I wanted to understand how businesses worked, how decisions shaped people's lives, and maybe, just maybe, be a part of something bigger." Ross nodded, his expression one of genuine interest as he listened, his gaze never leaving hers. "But," she continued, her voice softening as her thoughts drifted back to the past, "there's more to it. I wasn't always able to see things as I do now." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, his brow furrowing slightly as he regarded her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Laura took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the edge of the fountain as she spoke, the memories surfacing, vivid and clear. "I was born blind," she explained, her voice calm, though her heart beat faster with the vulnerability of the admission. "For most of my life, I experienced the world through sounds, textures, scents. It was a world I understood, a world I thought I would always be a part of." She paused, glancing up to gauge his reaction. Ross's expression was thoughtful, his gaze steady and filled with empathy, encouraging her to continue. "But a few years ago, I was given an opportunity, she said, her voice softening as she remembered. A company, a foundation, funded a surgery for me, one that allowed me to see for the first time. I spent months in rehabilitation, learning to adapt to this new way of experiencing the world. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Ross listened intently, his expression a mixture of awe and admiration. "That's incredible," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "I can't imagine what that must have been like, to see everything for the first time." Laura smiled, a hint of wonder in her gaze as she looked at him. "It was like stepping into a new dimension. Colors, light, shadows. They all felt surreal, like a dream I hadn't known I was having. And now, I can't imagine my life any other way. But even as I embraced my new reality, there was a part of me that held on to that other world, that world of sound and touch. It's still a part of who I am." Ross nodded slowly, a look of understanding crossing his face as he absorbed her story. "You've been through so much, and yet, here you are, chasing dreams and defying curses." She chuckled, a warmth blossoming in her chest as she looked back at him. "I guess you could say I'm stubborn." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made her smile widen, the connection between them deepening as they shared the moment. There was something grounding about his presence, a quiet strength that made her feel seen, understood in a way that went beyond words. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the soft murmur of the fountain blending with the sounds of the park, a gentle symphony that seemed to echo the beauty of their shared stories. And in that silence, Laura felt a sense of peace, a feeling of completion that she hadn't known she was searching for. As they turned to head back to the office, side by side, a comfortable warmth settled between them. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city, the last rays of light filtering through the trees and illuminating their path. When they arrived back at Givens Corp., they were greeted with a roar of cheers and applause. Her colleagues had gathered in the lobby, their faces alight with excitement and joy, their cheers echoing through the building as they celebrated the end of the Givens curse. Sharon was there, snapping photos with a grin, Adam giving her a thumbs up as he laughed, the warmth and laughter of the crowd wrapping around her like an embrace. Laura glanced at Ross, a smile tugging at her lips as she shook her head in disbelief. "It seems they were waiting for this moment almost as much as we were." He chuckled, nodding as he looked around at the gathered crowd. "I think they have been. And you know, I couldn't have asked for a better ending to this story." Laura's heart swelled with happiness as she looked around at the faces of her friends, her teammates, the people who had stood by her, laughed with her, and cheered her on through every twist and turn of her journey. And as she looked back at Ross, she knew that this moment, this long-awaited meeting, was only the beginning of something new, something filled with possibility and promise. The Givens curse was broken, and in its place was a connection, a story, and a future that felt as bright and limitless as the sky itself. Part 2. Discovering Melly. The warmth of the office celebration lingered in Laura's heart as she stood by her desk, the applause and laughter slowly fading as her colleagues returned to their work. Her encounter with Ross had been everything she'd imagined, and more, a culmination of near misses and frustrations, finally ending with a connection that felt both surprising and natural. Yet, as the excitement of the moment began to settle, Laura felt something unexpected stirring within her, a sensation she couldn't quite place, a quiet awareness tugging at the edges of her consciousness. As she looked around at the familiar faces of her colleagues, a thought settled in her mind, unbidden and persistent. Her heart beat faster as she realized just how much of herself she had kept hidden from them, how many layers of her story were buried beneath the surface. She had revealed pieces to Ross, shared a glimpse of her journey to receiving her sight, but even then, she had kept it safe, guarded. There was so much more than she had ever let herself acknowledge. She took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair as she closed her eyes, her mind drifting to memories she had long avoided. The faint sound of her own name echoed in her mind, soft and gentle, the way it had sounded years ago when she'd been known by a different name, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. Melly. The name surfaced like a whisper, a memory of the life she had once lived. Her name was Melissa, and Melly had been her nickname, a term of endearment she had used throughout her childhood. But after the surgery, after her life had changed so completely, she had stopped using it and used her middle name, Laura, letting it slip away like a shadow in the light. It was as if Melly belonged to a different life, a different version of herself, one she had left behind. The thought made her heart ache, a bittersweet pang that filled her with both longing and sorrow. She hadn't just changed her life. She had buried a part of herself, had hidden away the girl she had once been, as if by doing so, she could erase the past. But now, as she sat there, the memories rising to the surface, she realized that Melly was still a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, and she looked up to see Mindy standing nearby, her expression curious, almost hesitant. Mindy had softened toward her in recent months, their initial tension fading into something closer to camaraderie, even friendship. Laura had noticed the change, had felt Mindy's kindness in the subtle ways she offered help, the quiet ways she showed support. And now, as Mindy approached, there was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a question lingering just below the surface. "Laura," Mindy began, her voice soft but steady. "Can I ask you something?" Laura nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips as she gestured for Mindy to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Mindy took a seat, her gaze thoughtful as she folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, she hesitated, as if weighing her words, her expression a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "I hope this doesn't come across as intrusive," she began, her tone gentle. "But I've noticed something about you. You seem to have these skills, things that most people wouldn't know unless they'd spent time in a certain kind of environment." Laura's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening as she realized what Mindy was hinting at. The skills she was referring to weren't just the usual professional talents. Mindy had noticed something deeper, something that connected to her past in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. Mindy continued, her voice soft but sincere. "I know it's none of my business, but how did you learn those things? I have a brother who's blind and, well, you remind me of him in certain ways." The words hung in the air, filled with an unspoken understanding, a bridge that connected their experiences in ways Laura hadn't expected. Her gaze softened, her heart filling with both gratitude and trepidation as she looked at Mindy, seeing not just a colleague but someone who understood, who saw beyond the surface. Taking a deep breath, Laura looked down at her hands, the memories stirring within her, raw and vivid. For so long, she had kept this part of herself hidden, had worn her new identity like a shield, protecting herself from the vulnerability of her past. But now, in this moment, with Mindy's quiet encouragement, she felt the walls begin to crumble, the pieces of her story falling into place. "Before the surgery, before all of this," she began, her voice quiet, steady. "I was blind. My name was Melissa, but everyone called me Melly. It was the only world I knew, the world of sounds, textures, scents. I learned to navigate it, to understand it, and in some ways, I loved it. But when the opportunity came to receive my sight, I took it. And when I did, I thought I could leave that part of myself behind." Mindy's gaze softened, a look of quiet empathy filling her eyes as she listened, her expression open and accepting. Laura felt a strange sense of relief, a release of the tension that had been building within her, the weight of her hidden past finally lifting as she allowed herself to speak, to share the truth. "After the surgery, I spent months in rehabilitation, learning to adapt to this new world. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, terrifying. But it was also beautiful," Laura continued, her voice trembling with the emotion of the memories. "But in my excitement, in my determination to embrace my new life, I buried Melly. I thought that by letting her go, I could step fully into this new life, become the person I thought I was meant to be." Mindy reached out, placing a gentle hand on Laura's arm, her touch a quiet reassurance that encouraged her to continue, to let the truth unfold. "But the thing is," Laura whispered, her gaze distant. Melly didn't disappear. She's still a part of me, still woven into everything I am. The skills you noticed, the way I navigate certain situations, those are things I learned as Melly. They're not just skills. They're pieces of a life I lived, a world I loved. And for so long, I've been hiding them, hiding her, as if by doing so, I could erase that part of myself. The weight of her words settled over her, filling the room with a quiet, profound stillness. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, the release of years of denial, of buried memories finally surfacing, allowing her to see herself fully, to accept the parts she had hidden away. Mindy squeezed her arm gently, her eyes filled with understanding, with acceptance that went beyond words. You don't have to hide her anymore, Laura. Melly is a part of you, and she always will be. And from where I'm standing, she's a pretty incredible person. Laura smiled, a sense of peace washing over her as she met Mindy's gaze, her heart filling with gratitude, with a newfound acceptance that soothed the ache she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For so long, she had been divided, two versions of herself existing side by side, each one struggling for space, for recognition. But now, in this moment, she felt the pieces come together, a unity that felt both freeing and profound. As they sat in silence, a shared understanding settled between them, a bond that connected them in ways that went beyond words. Laura felt a quiet strength building within her, a determination to embrace every part of herself, to honor the life she had lived, the journey that had brought her here. Mindy, she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you. For seeing me, for understanding, for helping me remember who I am. Mindy smiled, her eyes warm and kind as she nodded. Thank you for sharing, Laura. I think Melly would be proud of you. Laura's heart swelled with emotion, a sense of peace and fulfillment that filled her to the brim. She wasn't just Laura or Melly. She was both, a tapestry of experiences, of lives lived and memories cherished. And as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet warmth of friendship, she knew that she was finally whole, finally free to be herself. And somewhere, deep within her, she felt a quiet whisper, a soft, gentle reminder of the girl she had once been, a girl who had faced the world with courage and resilience, who had embraced life with open arms. And in that moment, she knew that Melly was still with her, a part of her heart that would never fade. Laura smiled, feeling the weight of her past settle comfortably within her, a quiet, profound peace that filled her with hope.